Hello and welcome back to Read Becca for a quick chat about a book that I recently read and enjoyed. And that book is Sun Tzu in Space by Gregory D. Miller. This was a wonderful nonfiction book. I did request an advance copy from the publisher and NetGalley for an honest review, of course. And I enjoyed it very much. I'm glad I requested it. This one is actually coming out on March 14th from the Naval Institute Press. So thank you very much to them, as well as the author, for giving me a copy to review for you guys. So I enjoyed this because it really is incorporating all the elements of history, international relations, politics, and strategy, and then tying in science fiction examples of how power dynamics might play out in space. Now, I did kind of go in thinking or hoping maybe this would touch on how we interact with aliens. So alien first contact scenarios, this is not that book though. I still did enjoy it very much though. It tackles how Earth nations or powers would interact in space and how that would have repercussions back on Earth between those world powers. So we are talking about actually working through future scenarios based on international relations theory. And that starts out very simple. So at the beginning, and we always follow the same structure through the whole book. So at the beginning, we're looking at basically real world dynamics. What happens if you have one world nation as a major power? What happens if you have two world nations as a major power and then a third is rising in threat? And over the course of each chapter, we basically go through a scenario, and that scenario is usually starting from around 2030 and playing out over a couple hundred years. And it's written in the format of looking back on what has happened over however long the duration of that scenario is, and exactly how this international relations theory would play out. So it's things like, in 2030, this happened, and then in 2040, this would have happened, and here's the effect that it would have had. But it's a little more engaging than simply listing things off like that. Next, after we get through the scenario and playing out this imagined future, we talk through the actual theory behind it, the international relations theory that is the basis for that scenario. And so I learned, I think, the most there. And once we're through talking about and understanding the international relations theory, then we dive into more context for how things might differ depending on how people react, talking through examples from science fiction and history of where that has played out and how it actually played out that way. And so we're drawing from everything in classic sci-fi, like different Asimov works or Dune. There's definitely a heavy reliance on classic sci-fi. So there also are some newer examples that come up, like Red Rising or The Expanse. When we're talking through the example where we have two world powers with a third rising, we're getting a historical example of US and Russia with China rising after the Cold War. And then we're talking through The Expanse with Earth and Mars, and then the Belters coming up as a new rising power. So yeah, it does a great compare and contrast there, I think, for a science fiction reader especially to be engaged with. For my own taste, I do kind of wish that the scenarios had played out in a more branching way so that we could see how each outcome might be more influenced. So we could have positive or negative impacts to the scenario and kind of speculate about that outcome. That's not the case. So we are very on rails with the scenarios of it only plays out one way specifically. And some of the scenarios do more or less discussion in the actual chapter part and theory part of how we could maybe positively impact it, but that's very minor. And especially in kind of the wrap up at the end, there's a little bit about that, but not very much. I really wish there had been more of how do we influence this? How do we make the right choices in strategizing politically? And this doesn't really do that. I also really felt that the examples are heavily weighted to the modern world. I wish we had gotten some examples from maybe ancient empires. We don't really see very much of that, other than a few mentions. And the author does even engage with that topic very briefly in, I think, one paragraph where he brings up the fact that modern nation states have not always been the main political structure and probably will not always be. So there will be changes into how those world powers look or work. And in the references there, he discusses just the mention of things like the church, the Roman Catholic Church, being a major world power influencing politics. Things like city-states as a major power player. And I wish we had gone more into those examples rather than just simply saying they have been that way and then not really talking about it. So I do wish it had been more varied in terms of the time periods historically that were incorporated into those examples. I also wish it had been more varied in terms of geography. It seems very Western-centric in terms of engaging with these sort of political powers, along with being quite modern. So yeah, I could have seen more variance there, definitely. The framing here at times is very anthropocentric for me, and so I do wish that the author had kind of made the case for that. He really doesn't. It's just taken for granted and assumed that the reader will be in total agreement that human survival as a species is a paramount goal that we must pursue and outdoes even potential harms that we might do. So I'm obviously not on board with that, but I think either the author making the case for that or maybe even just framing it as that's what world political powers are going to think is the top goal, right? So go along with that as your scenario. Yeah, I don't know about how I feel on that, and it wasn't a big enough element that I think it's a real negative, but it did seem odd that it's just sort of taken for granted throughout the book. With those few detracting items, though, I would have to say that the way that this played out, in the end, the thing I most learned, and I think was the goal of this book, was the international relations theory. I do feel like I learned a lot about that. So talking about the strengths, I think the back half of this book was basically all strengths. I really enjoyed getting beyond the simplistic breakdowns of, individual nation state world powers, where we get into the back half, we're talking through theories about feminist worldview, Marxism, corporations and international organizations, even terrorist organizations, and how those would sort of interact with space. As well, we also do briefly tackle AI and the idea of humanity sort of giving up power to optimization through algorithms, and what happens if an AI sort of runs amok, but not in the, I, Robot sort of way, definitely not that, much more in AI sort of knows best and it suppresses things to do with Earth and humanity, and it makes more sense even at times for optimization for AI to be dominant in space over sending humans. So I think there were a lot of really interesting elements in the back half in exploring those different sort of dynamics. Specifically, corporations was also very interesting to me, because when you're looking at international or multinational companies, private organizations, it does even, drop some specific company names that are pursuing moving into space here. But what happens if a multinational corporation makes it into space first and they establish the norms for how things operate in space, and then nations have to either follow that or create conflict to change the norms? And how does it affect that corporation operating back on Earth if they're at conflict with these world nations that they're now interacting with in space as well, or having conflict with in space? So that, as well as trade. I mean, trade was very interesting to me because I do enjoy things to do with economics. So I think that all was really richly laid out. So I think all of that plays together to provide us with some interesting insight that we can apply here on Earth with thinking through political strategy. So I definitely think that this book would be great for people who are really into poli-sci, or people who are just hard sci-fi nerds who love the political strategy aspect of this and who like the idea of having sci-fi incorporated into it. I do think this was maybe on the very academic end. It's a bit dry at moments, but I think it's very readable. There was nothing that I struggled to understand as I was reading. So I do think that kind of nerdy reader like myself is going to be into this. I also think that this is probably a course book for something on this topic. It was definitely a course I would be interested in taking. It sounds very cool. And I think the goal of that course is to teach these international relations theories. And I think it was successful at that. That was less what I was interested in necessarily, but I feel like I came away with a good grasp of those. So I think that's mainly it for my discussion of this book. I have a couple brief notes about context for the advanced copy that I reviewed that I have to assume will be changed in the final version. So number one, the formatting. Formatting with advanced copies is always a bit iffy, so there were definite formatting problems here. Nothing that impacted my ability to read the text, but there are things like upper and lowercase mixes, things where words are split on separate lines, things like that here and there. Most of it was formatted just fine. There are also a number of data tables throughout that I wasn't able to see to review, so I have to assume those will be in there and properly formatted. That's all a bit par for the course. There was also a minor, maybe editing issue in terms of moving content around in the chapters, where I did find multiple times over the course of this that we would be talking through, and fairly far into a chapter, like 10, 15, 20 pages, we would be discussing a concept, and then all of a sudden, the start of a new paragraph, we would get a basic definition or explanation of that concept that you would have had to understand in order to know what was going on over the past 10, 15 pages. So I assume that's just, this was not fully finished being edited and things had gotten moved around and not quite cleaned up. So I would hope that is all corrected in the final copy. So that is it for Sun Tzu in Space. Look for it at hopefully your local bookstore on March 14th. And thank you so much for watching.